One of the big stories we're watching for you today, the Pretoria High Court is expected to deliver judgment in the Life Esidimeni tragedy. 144 psychiatric patients died in 2016 after they were moved from Life Esidimeni facilities to ill-equipped NGOs. Newzroom Africa's Veronica Makhoali joins me now to give us a timeline of these events and some of the expectations from today. Veronica, we spent much of the morning talking to NGOs. We've spoken to victims' families as well. It's still, these wounds still cut very, very deep all these years on. And today is really a big day. One of the key expectations from court is that there will be criminal liability for some of the players. Talk us through that.
Absolutely, man. And I think that is not only, essentially this fight for the right to dignity. It didn't just begin today in terms of holding some of them, what they believe some of the former Gauteng health officials liable, accountable for essentially what took place. It all started, quite a few years back, looking back at June 2015, in fact, where there were some rumors about the Gauteng Health Department wanting to go ahead, of course, to essentially end the contract with Life Esidimeni, a really well-specialized hospital that dealt with mental health care patients back in 2015. This, of course, was heard by Section 27 and the families and the patients who then pleaded essentially with the health department to say, please consider the risk that you would be putting some of these patients in if you had to, of course, cancel the contract of this facility and essentially close it. Their concerns essentially were brushed to the side. And by October 2015, we then had the former MEC for Health in Gauteng, Makhoali, going ahead essentially with ending this contract. This would lead, Iman, to about 3 months between April and June in 2016 for the department scrambling essentially to place about 1,700 mental health care patients across Gauteng. And what we then saw, Iman, essentially was a shoddy job in an attempt to essentially cut costs, where these patients were put across several NGOs that were either unlicensed, ill-equipped, and of course, essentially also getting sense of the fact that they were just not really, properly serviced to help the patients that were there in terms of the care that they needed. And it's very important to mention that there were mental health care patients, and so that care was quite unique to them.
There was a lot of arrogance here. We spoke to Mark Hayward this morning, who was the former head of Section 27. When you talk about some of those organizations that went to the provincial health department officials to say, hey, we want to warn you against doing this. You're thinking about the South African Depression and Anxiety Group, yep. A number of different people. In fact, let's just listen to how Mark answered the question when I spoke to him earlier this morning about the fact that they were pled with not to choose this route. Let's listen.
I think the first thing we have to know about the Life Esidimeni tragedy is that it was completely preventable. From 2015, family members had, as you've correctly pointed out, begun to raise the alarm. The Southern African Depression and Anxiety Group, known as SADAG, in particular, was highlighting the dangers and the problems. People were talking to the Gauteng Department of Health, including to people like Makhoali, Barney Celebano, and so on, and saying, please do not do this. There is a danger that lives will be lost. And they were ignored. There were in those months some attempts to kind of humor the families, humor Section 27. There were meetings. There was the suggestion that there might be a change to the plan. But in the end, the Gauteng Health Department just steamed ahead with the closure of the Life Esidimeni facility in 2016. And then we know what happened.
And Veronica, Mark there talking about people like the former health MEC, Dr. Makhoali, Barney Celebano, but also names like Makhoali Manamela and Ethel Ncube. So there are some people that family members are hoping will be held directly responsible. Talk to us about the scope of the expectation, or maybe even to the inquest itself, how that process ran, and whether there might be this opportunity for individual liability.
Yeah, absolutely. I think within the inquest, we also managed to really see the blaming and the finger pointing within the health department, and also what essentially has been, the cry for many of the parents, for many of the families, and that is the lack of accountability. We heard during the inquest as well, some of the reasons that were given for the move and the cost cutting was that there needed to be, a budget cut in terms of, what was being given essentially to the Life Esidimeni and the budget constraints within the Gauteng department. But also what we managed to see as well during that inquest, Iman, was I think what really most of the families, were looking for, someone to take accountability, and the judgment that will be handed down today will essentially be what will prompt the National Prosecuting Authority to see if it will take any criminal, action against some of these officials. You'd remember around the 26th of March in 2016, that's when we first had the first death that was recorded, that became headlines, and it essentially pulled the curtain back to what was probably one of the worst inhumane conditions I think that any South African has experienced, and really also exposed, the lack of accountability within the Gauteng Health Department as well.
What you've just said provides the perfect segue to how Mark Hayward described the inhumane treatment of those patients.
What it said about the officials overseeing their care was that they were totally callous, inhumane, oblivious to suffering, even when it was right in front of their eyes, unwilling to listen to appeals of family members with all of the concerns that they obviously had. Remember that we are dealing here with people who were very vulnerable because they were people who had mental illnesses, disabilities, didn't know properly what was going on, didn't often have the few sources of comfort that they would have in family members, sometimes herded onto trucks, taken to NGOs, taken to places that didn't have their medical records, that didn't have sufficient healthcare workers, that didn't have the medicines that were needed for those people. And again, without being those people, you can't understand the pain, the suffering, the confusion, the indignity that people went through. We only really learn about the indignity when we started, after hearing about the deaths, to sort of piece together what had happened.
Veronica, as you go back and listen, to the recollections of NGOs who were right there in the middle, trying to raise the alarm, but also just keeping an inventory of the suffering and the aftermath, it really does reanimate the tragedy that was. Talk to us about what happens next insofar as the NPA is concerned, because in this pursuit for individual criminal liability, what the families are hoping to hear in that judgment today is how the evidence stacked up against people's conduct, the omission of the execution of their duty, not listening to the warnings and so on. We had, of course, all of that testimony that was presided over by DCJ, Deputy Chief Justice Dikgang Moseneke, who managed the evidence that was given to the panel, which then resulted in the inquest itself. So that's a big piece of today.
Absolutely, man. And I think, we were speaking as well to Mark Hayward earlier, and I just, heard him saying that, in a sense, that they are cautiously optimistic in what could come out of today's, judgment. While the evidence is there, and while we've seen the harrowing tales, the headlines, and spoken to, just those personal families in terms of what they have seen, what we are, of course, hoping for the families as well is also some form of accountability. I mean, you've seen, of course, as well, that during the early days, during the arbitration, that families were also compensated in somewhat, but that does not even come close to essentially what happened. And I think from today's judgment, perhaps it will also serve as somewhat of a warning, somewhat of a change in system in terms of saying it shouldn't just be NGOs and families that hold these kind of institutions accountable, but also perhaps maybe also to ring an alarm on some of the other systematic issues that we're seeing in terms of the services provided by the departments. I mean, if you look at as well the social health department, they are somewhat facing a very similar thing. And so this judgment is to say, how do we prevent another Life Esidimeni? If you're seeing the social health department, the social welfare department rather, facing those budget constraints, many of the housing projects, many of the NGOs saying that we can no longer house women and children in safe houses, we can no longer house victims of GBV because of these budget constraints. And it says to us, what then do we need to do to prevent this? And perhaps this judgment will be that warning. Perhaps this judgment will be able to say, how do we prevent another Life Esidimeni?
I mean, almost 10 years away from the horror, the initial horror, or 9 years away, from the initial horror of when all of this happened. Yeah. And one of the observations that a number of researchers, NGOs, people directly involved in the sector are saying is we're not beginning to see the turnaround in healthcare. We're not beginning to see the requisite investment in things like carers. We're not beginning to see better public education in terms of mental health. Mental health is all across South African society. It's almost in every home in some shape or form. And without the benefit of understanding and information sharing, without access to proper, well-equipped, well-resourced facilities, we are possibly building a similar tragedy. Hopefully that doesn't happen. Veronica, we will continue to watch this through your eyes. We've got a whole reporting team that's dedicated to the events of today and the aftermath.